Right on the dot, 90000. Good morning and welcome into our Sunday Bible study. I have to tell you that I may or may not have switched directions as far as what was originally planned. We had some really good questions that were brought out at the end of our last Bible study, and for those who are new to our class, so it's Speech Seasoned with Salt is our series. And we've been talking about how do we address things with people when they bring up the question that we probably get more than any other, and that is, why does your church not have instruments in worship? And so we've been talking about that for a couple of weeks. That was my original plan, only to do that. However, at the end of class, we had some excellent follow-up questions that were brought up, and I hated that we didn't have the time to address those. And I'm a big person on keeping pace whenever you have Bible study. But I also have to stop at times and remind myself, if there's curiosity and there's not complete comprehension on something, sometimes it's good to take a little bit more time and just slow down and cover what those things are. So we're going to take a couple of weeks, just 2 more, and that's all total. But to cover the questions that came up, in large part, number one, to make sure that we understand a biblical and historical answer to these questions ourselves, but also with a view toward, well, how can I explain this and hopefully bring this across to people in the best possible way? So the 3 questions that were brought out, some of these were during Bible class and some even just right after, an excellent discussion from those. The first of these questions is, well, when I read in the book of Revelation, there are instruments being used to worship God in heaven. So if it's being done there, obviously God wouldn't have any potential issue with it, so why would there be any concern with my doing it on the earth? It comes from passages like this. Turn to, if you will, Revelation chapter 14. Revelation 14, and we're going to read there verse 2, and I'll be reading out of the New King James Version, so yours might read just a hair differently. Revelation 14, second verse. John says, "And I heard a voice from heaven, like the voice of many waters, and like the voice of loud thunder. And I heard the sound, in KJV, I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps." Okay, I'm not the most brilliant tool in the shed. However, when I read that someone is hearing the sound of harpists with their harps, well, what do you think that tells me? Okay, there are people with harps and they're playing harps. So that's just common sense, right? It would seem to be the case. All right, let's just stop there. And I know I have verse 3. We're not going to read it right now, but we'll come to that here in just a moment. What I'd like to do, though, is I would like to show you a few different translations of this passage. And these are all word-for-word translations of the Bible except for one, the NIV, which, of course, is widely circulated also. So let's look at these together. And Revelation 14, verse 2, the different translations of this. The New King James Version, if you're in the back and it's hard to see in the front, it might be easier to see on the back screen. I know that's a little small. But to put all of them up and to compare them side by side, I think it helps. So the New King James, we just read that. You have the sound of harpists playing their harps. Notice every other translation of this. The English Standard Version, the voice was like the sound of harpists. So as we look at that one, it's actually not harps at all being played, but there's a voice coming out and it sounds like harps being played. Hang on to that. King James Version, the voice of harpers. The American Standard Version, the voice was as, not that, but it was similar to, the voice of harpers. New American Standard Bible, the voice was like the sound of harpists. Young's literal translation, what he heard was a voice of harpers. The New International Version, the sound was like that of harpists. You compare all the Bible translations of it, and it's not saying there are actually harpists playing their harps, but there was a sound coming out that was similar to that or reminded the writer of it. Now, any ideas as to why this would be compared? What would be true? Has anyone heard a harp being played in real life? I don't believe I ever have. Okay, see, you've seen videos, okay, and you've heard it from that, and you've actually heard it. What does it sound like? Thanks, Bradley. Any females like to give us a description of what you heard? Yeah, okay. That's kind of what I figured. Now, from what I hear and understand about it, it might be in ways, and I know it's not exactly the same thing, so hear me out on this, but from comparing it to what I have heard, maybe something like a violin. When I hear a violin being played and well understood, but when I hear someone who knows how to play a violin and a beautiful melody on it, it makes me want to melt like a chocolate bar in a volcano. I mean, it's gorgeous. And that's what I hear about a harp. Yes, sir? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But, of course, I mean, with instruments in general and someone who knows how to play them and well, there's a melody coming off, and it's beautiful to hear. And that makes a lot of sense because that's the point right here, that the voice that was being heard in these songs, it was so beautiful. It was like that you would hear coming off of a stringed instrument, and perhaps as well, Joe, the idea of it's very unique what it was that I heard. And I'll show you why from Revelation 14 here in a moment. That's probably the case. I want to go back, though, to this, just generally, the book of Revelation. Turn to chapter 1, verse 1. By the way, this is it's one of two things. Some translations have it either it's a simile, it's a comparison using like or as, and as some other versions have it, it's if not that, it's a metaphor, which is the same thing. It's a comparison, only you're not using like or as. But one thing is standing for or being compared to because of the similar characteristics between the two, a figure of speech. Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. Before we even start reading this book, there's something that the Holy Spirit through the writer says we need to understand about it. Revelation 1:1. This is the revelation, the disclosure of Jesus Christ, the revelation of Jesus Christ, who sent and had this message signified by his angel through his servant John. Key word here. Signified. What's the base of that single term? Okay, significance. I like that. But in a simpler form. I'm sorry. Okay, signal, good. Signal sign, yeah, okay. And there's a significance behind it. I would agree with all these that have been brought out. But sign, or a symbol, lots of signs and symbols. The book is filled with them, and for a good reason. So much of the content of Revelation, of course, it's about how God's people win, and no matter who attacks them, they're victorious in battle. Okay, they win in the end. But a big part of this is who's attacking them right now? God's church, first century, especially toward the end of it. The Roman government, and a huge part of this is how the Roman government is waging war against the first century Christians. But just like every other entity that's ever attacked the people of God, they don't win. And the Christians defeat them. Now, if it's just written in so many words for this group that's already oppressing the Christians and even killing many of them, and then they read that, oh yeah, in their religion, the Christians are doing battle with these Romans, and they're going to beat them. They're going to destroy the nation. What do you think is going to happen with this writing, first of all? Okay, I mean, they're already gathering religious writings and burning them anyway, but it's not going to survive, or not nearly as many copies anyway. And the other thing is this, the persecution against the Christians is only going to ramp up. But God knows that his people need this message of even though the Romans are oppressing you, keep fighting the good fight of faith and you win. You defeat them in the end. But it needs to be written in this hidden language so that people of the Bible or are familiar with the Bible know what God is saying. But people on the outside, like the Romans, think it's just a bunch of nonsense, and so they just let it float around and circulate, even though it has to do with their own demise. That's why this sign language is written. In the book of Revelation, we'll have some in our sermon a little bit later. There's talk of a dragon, of a lion, of a lamb, of a snake, and there's also this weird creature that comes out of the water that has all these heads and different horns coming off of it. They're not to be interpreted literally. They're all symbolic. By the way, the dragon / snake, who does that represent? The lamb / lion, who does that represent? Now, here's a little tougher one. The 10-headed beast with all the horns coming off of it, who does that represent? There you go. It seems to be probably the Roman Empire, and then the heads and the horns in particular, the different rulers of the Roman. Anyway, the point is this, though, that there are all these signs and symbols that are found throughout the book. So we shouldn't be surprised when we encounter statements like, I heard this incredible melody unlike anything, and it was like harpers harping on their harps, even though it wasn't exactly that, because there are all kinds of figures that are used throughout the apocalyptic account. Now, I kind of hit on this, but I'm sorry for not having the time to turn to and demonstrate. I never want to do that. When you're crunched in time, sometimes you have to, because I don't want anyone to think, well, that's just his opinion, or I want to show you from the Scriptures why this is the case. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And what I want to demonstrate to you is that we can know that there is no harp in heaven, there's no piano in heaven, there's no guitar in heaven. My heart might be melting like chocolate in a volcano, but it's not going to be from a violin that I hear in that place. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 50. Paul says, now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. It's talking about the kingdom of God future, not present in this case. So flesh and blood cannot enter into heaven. Why is that? He goes on to explain, nor does corruption inherit incorruption, or what is corruptible inherit what is incorruptible. We might say it this way: what is physical cannot enter what is spiritual. And that's why you have the whole section of teaching in 1 Corinthians 15, post-resurrection, that when we're raised, we have to be transformed, our bodies. Why? We don't get to go to heaven if they're not, because heaven is a spiritual place. And what is physical cannot inherit or enter into that which is spiritual. Even Jesus himself, his physical body in that form could not enter into heaven. He, and that's again a purpose of 1 Corinthians 15, he's the first fruits from the dead, and then we'll follow in his likeness. We have to be changed or transformed into that which is spiritual, because what's physical is not going into the spiritual place of heaven. Joe? Decays, dies, right. Right. So, very, very good. So, the point being this: a musical instrument, what happens to it? If you're talking about stringed instruments, or stringed instrument, strings break, right? They wear out. As well, the body of the instrument wears out. It decays. If it's something that's wooden, eventually it'll get brittle, break, and or rot. If it's something that's metal, it's going to rust over time. Eventually it's going to be gone. But the point being this: nothing physical can enter that which is spiritual. What is true of every musical instrument? It's physical. Therefore, it cannot enter into and be a part of heaven, because what's physical cannot enter into that which is spiritual. So, I think that helps as well to understand from Revelation, and it's the same thing. It's not unique, by the way, with musical instruments. It's also true. We talk about the street in heaven. What's it? Okay. There's no street of gold in heaven. The gate's made of what? Pearls. There are no pearls in heaven. The walls are made of, we don't talk about this one as much, but the walls are made of precious gems, but not real ones. Not like physical ones. So why are we being told all these things? The sea of glass, by the way. There's no glass in heaven. Why are we being told all these things if it's not actually that way? There you go, perception. And when you're a physical people and all you know is the physical, you have to take something that you know, at least to compare to what you don't know. And that's why it's the street of gold. It's valuable. It's beautiful. The sea of glass. It's a scenic sight. Same thing with the gate of pearls and the walls of gems. The whole point is it's beauty unlike anything you've ever beheld. Okay, so why this comparison with a musical instrument if it's just talking about the singing and the voice of things? Go back to Revelation chapter 14, or maybe you're still there, and then we'll go to 5 here in just a moment. But Revelation 14, notice what the point is in verse 2. I heard a voice from heaven. By the way, that's the same word that's used later at the end of the verse for sound. But the first 2 times in the New King James is translated a voice from heaven, like the voice of many waters. We didn't actually hear many waters, but what do many waters or a lot of water tell you? Anybody ever been to Niagara Falls? What's that sound like? Many waters, quote unquote. It's roaring. It's so loud. It's voluminous. Like the sound of loud thunder. Might even startle you when you hear it, but it's certainly something that commands your attention. And I heard the sound, same word that's translated voice earlier. It's the voice of those like harpists playing their harps. Go back up to verse 1. Why would this be the case? Because he says, I see a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000. Go down to verse 3. What are they doing? They sang, as it were, a new song before the throne that no one could learn except the 144,000. Have you ever been in a gathering with thousands of people who blend their voices? Some of us have. Was it 15 or 16 that year? I think it may have been 16. Okay, it may have been 15 the year before or something. At Challenge Youth Conference, 16,000. It's an amazing thing, that many people. You have this scene before heaven and all these blending their voices together. He says, I'm going to try to express to you what I heard. It's like Niagara Falls, the sound of it. It's like in the middle of a thunderstorm as far as its volume. And he says the beauty, the melody of it. Have you ever heard someone, I haven't, but playing a harp, or for me it would be a violin. The melody of it was like that. It was just incredible. Unlike anything you've ever heard. These are examples of. One other before we move on. Turn to chapter 5 of Revelation. I just want to give an example of this where it might make it even a little bit clearer of these figures of speech being utilized and including instruments. Revelation 5, verse 8. Now when Jesus had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Now here we're told clearly, each having a harp. What do you think the significance would be of holding a harp? You're just going to hold the harp and carry it around and never do anything with it? You have something like this to play, don't you? And it's not stated here, well, it's like that. It's similar to it. That's what they have. There you go. Is that our instruments finally in heaven? Well, they have something else too. We're told they had golden bowls full of incense. Oh, so it's not just harps, but it's also golden bowls. And there's incense inside, and you know what you do with incense? You light it, and it's probably being burned. But notice here we're clearly told about the golden bowls full of incense, which are, this is a metaphor, not stated to be like or as, they are, not literally, but figuratively, they are the prayers of the saints. The incense, the golden bowls full of incense. All right, let's pause and take a step back. If you have something, I'm sorry. You know, it could be. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, it could be, Paul. Right. Yeah, maybe. I hadn't considered that. Thank you. We'll look at it as if it were just the latter. Okay, worst case scenario, but you may be right. It actually may go back to both of them from the conjunction. So if you have something that's golden, what do you have on your hands? Okay, if you have a regular egg, what do you do with it? I know I do anyway. If you have a regular egg and it's in your fridge, it doesn't sit there. What do you do with that egg? You eat it. All right, if you have a golden egg, what do? You smile, and then you sell it for monies, right? All right, so if you have something that is golden, if you have a ceramic bowl, what do? Well, I get it down, I put my eggs in it, and I mix them around before I scramble them in the morning. If I have a golden bowl, I smile, and I take it to the bank. Why? Okay, because it's valuable. That's the concept of something that's golden. If you have something that's full, okay, if you have something that's full in a bowl, you have a lot of whatever it is. Incense. I mentioned this a moment ago. It was, anybody ever put this in your room? I'm sure it makes a difference, the quality of it. When I was a kid, we would buy like the 12 or 24 packs from Walmart of incense for like $2. And we would burn that in our rooms until Mom and Dad would get on to us and put that, that's nasty. I'm sure it gets a lot better than what that is. But incense, you light it, and if it's a good quality, what's true of it? Why would people do that? Yeah, it's an excellent scent that diffuses. So here's what you have. What is precious or valuable in concept, there's a lot of it, and it smells terrific as it ascends upward. Now, why would this, golden bowls full of incense, be compared to God saying, these are the prayers of the saints? How does God view the prayers of his own? Sweet smelling aroma, and that actually terminology is used multiple times in Scripture, Old Testament and New. What else? They are precious to him. And what kind of prayers or what type of frequency does God desire prayers? Often, or an overflow, a fullness of it. So does it make sense why the golden bowls full of incense are compared here to prayers? But we're clearly told, well, these are actual golden bowls full of incense that are found. It's a spiritual place. You're not going to have what is physical, but it's representative of in its concept. All right, in that context, we're told each having a harp. We've already established physical things aren't found in the spiritual place. So why is the harp here being used? What's it representing? Let's see from the context if we have any indication. Verse 9, just like in Revelation 14, get this. And they sang a new song, and they praised Jesus for what he's done on behalf of them. Verse 11, I looked and I heard the voice of many angels, not just people, but angels as well, like around the throne, living creatures. He talks about the number of them, saying with a loud voice, praising Christ in song. And every creature in heaven, on earth, under the earth, all that are in the sea, I heard saying, using their voice, praising Jesus for the blessings that he's brought to all people. And all the living creatures said, Amen, and everyone falls down before and worships. So if the golden bowls full of incense in the text we're clearly told are not actually that, but they're representative of the prayers of God's people, the harpists here, harping with their harps, would seem to represent what? But once again, the beautiful melody that's being brought to God in worshipful praise of song. So hopefully that helps to make some sense of, well, why is it that I find instruments being used in worship to God in the book of Revelation, if that isn't something necessarily that he would enjoin to us on the earth? There are no instruments in heaven. Revelation simply is describing the beauty and the melody of what's being sung in praise to God. Okay, so for the second one, now this is one that was not brought up in Bible class. I'm just going to tell you right now, this is a pretty deep one, okay? But I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but turn to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19. I know you heard that one before. Ephesians 19, and this is the basis from which this question springs. Ephesians 5:19, as God's people in the church, we are to be speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in our hearts to the Lord. There are two words of significance here. Psalm, and it's translated from psalmos, and then you also have, as you see at the top left here of the screen, psallo. Basically, they're the same word. Psalmos is translated as a noun into the noun, psalm, I should say transliterated in the passage. And then psallo is the verb form, and that's translated into, again, this is ESV, yours may be just a hair different here, but it's make melody, make melody. Now, I want to show you some background of this word. I want to be impartial about it and thorough while still, moving along. I'm going to show you 5 original word authority sources that are widely respected across the spectrum. These are not Church of Christ people, okay? But these are independent biblical scholars, and here's what they have to say about these two terms, mainly solo, and then a little bit at the end you'll see a blending of solos and what the meaning is as far as the background of this word. This comes from Strong's Complete Greek and Hebrew Dictionary. To touch or strike the chord, to twang the strings of a musical instrument so that they gently vibrate, to play on a stringed instrument, to play the harp, etc. Thayer's Greek English Lexicon, to sing to the music of the harp. Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament, to pluck or play a stringed instrument, to sing to the accompaniment of a harp. Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, solo first seems to mean to pluck a string, to play an instrument. And lastly, Vincent's Word Studies in the New Testament, a psalm was originally a song accompanied by a stringed instrument. And then the noun form again, our word psalm derived from a tune played upon a stringed instrument. Have you ever seen this before? This isn't something that gets discussed a whole lot, and this is an argument that's brought forward. Well, not only is there background to it, but if this is the case, then actually there would be a command in Ephesians 5:19 that whenever singing is done toward God, that instruments would have to be involved to give him what he desires. But what I want to do now is show you the fullness of the statements of each one of these word sources and not just take snippets. I say that, I don't have room to put everything, but the fullness and representation of what they say on this subject. So let's go back to Strong's Complete Greek and Hebrew Dictionary, to twang the strings of a musical instrument, to play on a stringed instrument, to play the harp. That's the background of this term. Originally, that's what it meant. But notice that Dr. Strong says, in the New Testament, though, it means to sing a hymn. Or by New Testament times, here's how this word was used. Thayer's Greek English Lexicon. Originally, it meant to sing to the music of the harp. Yet he says in the New Testament it means to celebrate the praises of God in song. The Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament, it meant to pluck or play a stringed instrument, to sing to the accompaniment of the harp. However, in the New Testament, it always refers to a song of praise being sung to God. Going back to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, solo first seems to mean to pluck a string, to play an instrument. But continues, it does not now literally denote playing on a stringed instrument. Psalmos is a Christian song which the individual sings at worship. All right, and the last one I mentioned, Vincent's Word Studies, and I saved this one for last because he kind of pieces all this together for us, a little more expressive. A psalm was originally a song accompanied by a string instrument. He says the idea of accompaniment, referring to instrumental accompaniment, however, passed away in usage and also in New Testament phraseology. In other words, originally this word here's what it meant. But by the time the New Testament era rolled around, its connotation had evolved, and it no longer accompanied the idea of instrumental music. It just meant to sing a song by the point of the New Testament era. He goes on to say, our word psalm derived from a tune played upon a stringed instrument. The verb, however, is used in the New Testament of singing praise generally. The noun psalm is used of singing an Old Testament song. And then he quotes a lot of very respected church historians. He mentions neither Basil, nor Ambrose, nor Chrysostom mention instrumental music early on in the church's days, and Basil expressly condemns it. Another word authority, which we'll use here a little bit later on, Bingham, church historian, dismisses the matter summarily and cites Justin Martyr. Anybody know who Justin Martyr is? Fascinating character from history. He lived from about AD 100, I want to say it's like AD 165. He may have very well been alive when John the Apostle still was. And he's the one who wrote the apologies, the Christian apologies of Justin Martyr. It was a defense of the Christian faith. He did this on behalf of the Christians because of how heavy the persecution was against them. And he knew he was putting himself on the radar whenever he did this. But he wrote these 2 apologies, and he sent them to the Roman Senate. Once and for all, just establishing, laying out, hey, listen, here's who the Christians are. Here's what they're doing. Here's also not who they are and what they're not doing. And you don't have any reason to be afraid of them, is his whole point. He had to have known it would probably cost him his life, which it did. But it's an excellent piece of history that survives these 2 manuscripts to this day. Because early on in the church, he lays out all the practices of the church and the things that they believed, the things they were doing, the things they didn't believe, the things that they weren't doing. Justin Martyr is cited about AD 150 as expressly saying that instrumental music was not used in the Christian church. The verb here is used in the general sense of singing praise, according to Vincent's word studies. The point is this: you can just pick snippets out of these word sources and make it sound awfully convincing that instrumental music was used in the early church's praise to God. In fact, that it ought to be used, but you have to do that by ignoring all the rest of what they say. And they're very clear to stipulate, although originally this is what the word meant, over time the meaning of the word evolved to mean singing only. I want to give you an example of how this works in our own culture and how we have to be careful about revisionist history. You know, I mentioned in the song, well, it wasn't a song, we had songs in the lesson that we mentioned, but about our worship and having life-changing worship toward God from 1 Corinthians 14. I mentioned in that a song I recall singing when I was still in college. It was about 20 years ago. And the chorus is a beautiful song, but in the chorus is the older version of it. And you just belt out, "I sing because I'm gay." Well, people who are to live a couple thousand years from now, if they were to go back and to examine records of church worship, say in the 1900s, let's go back to early part of 1900, and they were to find, you see, there was homosexuality that was being accepted in churches all across America, even in the early 1900s, because we have records of churches proudly singing about how they were gay. Well, you could say that if you want, but why would that be inaccurate? Very good. You can't use the meaning of a word at a different time to say, okay, well, here's what was going on, because that meaning has evolved. All people were saying in the early 1900s and through the 1900s by singing that song was, "I'm happy," right? Do you see the point, though, that's being made right here? You can't, 2,000 years later, take a meaning of a word, of what it meant centuries before, and say, see, here's what the Christians were doing in the early church. That's not what the word meant at the time. All of the linguistic experts are in agreement about this. I just want to quickly cite, I know we looked at a few of these a couple of weeks ago. We're not going to read through the fullness, but I wanted to show how the church historians and early fathers really back up these statements. Clement of Alexandria was an apostolic father who lived in the 2nd century, maybe just about 50 years separated from the lifetime of the Apostle John. The Catholic Encyclopedia, Volume 10, page 652, it's mentioned that the first Christians did not substitute lifeless instruments for or to use them to accompany the human voice. In fact, the church father, Clement of Alexandria, severely condemned their usage, even at Christian banquets. Now, that's not the worship of God that's taking place there. That would be like our potlucks. And I don't know if you're this way, but when I eat, I like to have something on at times in the background, not real big on music. I love having a TV on. I know that's not a great practice, but if I ever get the excuse to do it, every now and then I'll put the TV on while I watch something. Well, they liked something going on in the background also, but Clement of Alexandria said, listen, we shouldn't even be incorporating these into our potlucks, essentially. Now, right or wrong, that's a whole different conversation. But the point is this, it's just we need to keep them disconnected from what we're doing and the purposes of God, was his viewpoint. And again, you're getting toward about AD 200. Lyman Coleman, Presbyterian, super smart guy. He was born at the end of the 1700s and is an old man when he passed away. He lived until the 1880s. But Mr. Coleman was a graduate of Yale University as well as Princeton University, and he had a doctorate in divinity from Princeton. In fact, was a professor there for many years as well as other colleges and universities, but a deeply religious guy. And he used his smarts and his academics for the benefit of church history. And he's the one who even went to Europe. He's an American, but he went to Europe for 2 years to research, to do a revision of a book that he made, and it'll be the second one from which we'll quote, Antiquities of the Christian Church, but also to do this research over a couple of years because he wanted to produce a new work, which he did, the Apostolic and Primitive Church. Again, not a Church of Christ member, a Presbyterian. And here's what he has to say about the background of instruments used in music as far as worship to God. Both the Jews in their temple service and the Greeks in their idol worship were accustomed to sing with the accompaniment of instrumental music. In other words, the Jews used it regularly in their worship. The Greeks, in the service of all their Greeks and the Greek gods and goddesses, they use instrumental music all the time also. And he says, the converts to Christianity accordingly must have been familiar with this mode of singing. Yet it's strange, as I've gone through all of the records, and many of them in Europe at this time, he says, it is generally admitted because of the lack of evidence. The primitive Christians employed no instrumental music in their religious worship. In that former referenced work, Antiquities of the Christian Church, the organ constituted no part of the furniture of the ancient churches. Frank Landon Humphreys, he lived about 1900. He was born as about the middle of the 1800s and lived a ways into the 1900s. Frank Landon Humphreys, a very respected and credentialed church historian, wrote the book, The Evolution of Church Music, page 42. Not a Church of Christ member. This one's a little strange to me. I've looked and looked, and I can't find anything that really pins down his religious affiliation, although I do know this, that he was called reverend and I believe was recognized to be a priest. I think the likelihood is either he was Catholic or some close relation to that. And here's what he mentions in his work from all the research that he did. All the music employed in the early Christian services was vocal and was simply that. As was brought out to us last week as a reminder from Roy, the first real confirmed instance we know of instrumental music being introduced into Christian worship was done by so-called Pope Vitalian about the year AD 70, or AD, 700. Pope Vitalian, this comes from the American Encyclopedia, Volume 12. Pope Vitalian introduced organs into some of the churches of Western Europe about 670. But the earliest trustworthy account seems to be as a present that was sent by the Greek Emperor Constantine Copronymus to Pepin, king of the Franks, in 755. I say split the difference, and you're about AD 700. And that's the first real indicator we have of its being used. Now, before I move on, I would like to look back just at one more. Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon, we discussed him, recognized to be the prince of preachers across so many religious circles, the most famous Baptist preacher to have ever lived. I think you can make the case maybe the most famous and respected Protestant preacher of the whole Reformation era, even perhaps, maybe outside of Martin Luther himself. Charles Spurgeon, he was still alive less than 150 years ago. And here's what we have recorded by the statement of his contemporary, Professor Gerardo. And he says in the book, as he's quoted, Instrumental Music in the Church, page 176, Charles H. Spurgeon upholds an apostolic simplicity of worship. The great congregation that's so blessed with the privilege of listening to his instruction has no organ to assist them in singing praises to God. They find their vocal organs sufficient. Their tongues and voices express the gratitude of their hearts. In his own words in Spurgeon's Old Testament commentary, he says, I would as soon pray to God with machinery as I would sing to God with machinery. But the reason I go back and look at these quotes again is for this reason. What was his grounds, or what were his grounds for just having a cappella music in his church's worship less than 150 years ago? He says, or is said about him, the desire to uphold an apostolic simplicity of worship. Where do you think he found that apostolic model? There you go, the teaching of the apostles. He knew, Ephesians 5, verse 19, a scholar second to none, Charles Spurgeon. But he knew that the word solo did not mean to play an instrument. And all it meant was to sing by the time the New Testament was written. And his desire was, look, I just want to do it the biblical way. Now, on his level, I think probably he thought it sounded better. And as well, he knew he was following what God wanted in Scripture, and that's fine, that he wanted to do that. But that's his background for it. That's the way we find it in Scripture. The whole point of which is this. Everyone with a background to this, you look back even years, knew that the word solo by New Testament times no longer meant to play with an instrument. And by the way, I encourage you, check all the translations of the Bible that are word-for-word renditions and see if you find a single one, even though most of the translators are parts of groups that use instrumental music on a regular basis. See if there's one translation of a word-for-word nature that translates it to play a musical instrument with the singing. And there's a reason you're not going to find a single one, because the scholars behind it know that by New Testament times the word solo did not mean that. Okay, the last few minutes that we have remaining here. This question came up. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that instrumental music was used in the worship of God in the Old Testament. So, if it was used in the Old Testament and God was okay with that, why would his feelings be any different about the same thing, but at a different time? I wish we had the time to read these two passages, but I'll tell you that we do not. I'll just reference them. Exodus chapter 17, verses 5 and 6. The Israelites have left Egyptian captivity. So they're on the other side now of the waters, quite literally. And they're thirsty. How ironic. Having passed through all the water, now they need water. They need fresh water, though, not salty water that was found in the Red Sea. And so God recognizes this, and he tells Moses, I'm going to have you give water to my people. And what's his instruction as to how he wants Moses to bring this water out of this giant rock? There you go. He says, I want you to take your rod and whoosh, smack that rock. He does, and guess what? As God promised, water comes pouring out. We fast forward sometime down the scene, Numbers chapter 20, and God's people are thirsty in the middle of the desert. And guess what? There's this strange rock that follows them everywhere they go. And so God says, Moses, I want you to take your rod and I want you to go to this rock. You're going to bring water out. How does he tell him he wants water to come out of the rock this time? I want you to talk to that rock. Now, this is getting a little weird by this point. The first time's like, I don't know about that. The second time's like, that's bonkers. You would think, talk to a rock, really? And it's going to give you water? The first time, Exodus 17, Moses operates on the basis of what God has commanded him, and water comes out, and God's very pleased. The second time, Moses operates not on the basis of what God has commanded him, but on the basis of what God has not commanded. What has God not told Moses to do in this second occasion? He hasn't told him to strike the rock, okay? Well, he didn't say don't do it. And he told me to do it the first time. So I'll just go over here and I'll whack it a couple times and I'll strike it this time like I did the first time. And water comes out. The difference, though, is in God's feelings. What does he tell Moses as a result of his actions? Huh? There you go. And we're going to have a sermon on this, Joe, this morning. You will not enter into the promise. He was furious. Why? He just did what God had told him at another time to produce the same result. But the problem is he's operating on the basis not of what he's been told, but what he hasn't been told. Now, you take that and you compare that to the music that God has told us that he wants in his worship. In the Old Testament, it's very clear that the people of God were given instructions not only about singing, but also playing instruments. And guess what they did? They sang and they played instruments. And God was pleased with it. That's what he wanted. And in the New Testament, what has God instructed us about what he wants in his worship? To sing and to sing. Okay? Well, what if I start operating on the basis of what God hasn't told me instead of what he has told me? And furthermore, he wanted this at a different time, it appears. How about Moses? How did it work out with him? And believe me, I'm not trying to put myself in the judgment seat of God. I'm not going to say, well, these are going to be his exact words to you or to me. When all I'm doing is taking the pages that he's given us, and he says, I want you to study it and learn from it. And I'm trying to do that very thing. The point being this: we have instances in the Bible where God has told us at one time, do things this way. I want it done this way. And another time, it's the same desired end, but it's a different means he wants to get there. And we know how he felt about each one. I'm going to move through this because we're going to have to quit. I hate to. I'd like to finish it. But I will just do this. Appealing to the Old Testament, let's close on this. Appealing to the Old Testament for justification of our New Testament practices. Turn to Galatians 5, and these will be the last thoughts here. Galatians chapter 5. In the first verse, Paul tells the Christians, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. In the context, he's referring to Old Testament law going back to the 4th chapter. Stay in the New Testament. He says, don't go back to the Old Testament. Here's why. These people were trying to pick and choose, and there's one thing that they don't want to let go. And what's this one thing from verses 2 and 3 of Galatians 5? Circumcision. Okay? And they say, because under the law of Moses, he says, whoa, hold on, just right there. He says, I'm telling you right now that if you want to go back to a piece of the law of Moses, you'd better be consistent, because if you're going to justify your practices by it, you're going to have to go back to all the practices and start living under that law again. Indeed, I testify to every man who becomes circumcised, he is a debtor to keep the whole law. You can't pick and choose one or two commandments out of there and say, well, the rest doesn't apply, but this one still does. Verse 4, he says, I don't think you're going to want to do that, and here's why. You have become estranged from Christ. You're disconnected now from Jesus, you who attempt to be justified by the law. You have fallen from grace. If you want to try to justify your way of living now by the laws of the Old Testament, you have to go back to all those laws. But if you leave the New Testament to go back to the Old, here's the issue. You're back under a system that has no sacrifice that can take away your sins. So his recommendation is just stay where you are, justify New Testament practices with New Testament teaching, and don't try to go back to the Old Testament. How would it relate as far as the worship that God has told us he desires under the New Testament? Where do we need to look to find out how he wants New Testament worship done? But in the New Testament. That's where he's going to specify that for us. Okay, for next week, based on what's been brought up, what's the truth about these matters? How can we discuss these with others? So, I've mentioned about in the Old Testament, there's no doubt that there's instrumental music that is used in the worship of God, right? It's generally thought, there's no question that God commanded, that's what he desired to be done in the Old Testament. And for next week, in our final piece of this, we're going to examine, is that really what he ever desired under Old Testament law? So let's be thinking about that for next week. Okay, any closing comments before we dismiss and take a little break before worship? Okay, all right, thank you.